Why thousands of adults over 50 are suddenly eating peanut butter before bed. Most people think their health problems start during the day. But what if some of the most important things affecting your energy, sleep, and even your morning mood are happening while you're unconscious? Think about that for a second. Because every night your body enters a completely different biological state. Your muscles begin repairing. Your brain starts clearing waste. Your hormones reset, your blood pressure changes, your metabolism shifts, and whether those systems work efficiently or struggle often comes down to one simple question. Does your body have the fuel it needs to make it through the night? That's why so many adults over 50 are suddenly paying attention to something most people never think about. Not a supplement, not an expensive sleep aid, not a complicated routine, just a spoonful of peanut butter before bed. Sounds almost too simple. But the reason has very little to do with peanut butter itself, and everything to do with what happens between midnight and sunrise. Because here's something most people don't realize. Your body doesn't simply rest while you sleep. In many ways, it works harder. And after 50, that overnight work becomes more important than ever. The hidden change that happens. After 50, let's start with a question. Have you ever slept for 7 or 8 hours and still felt tired the next morning? Not exhausted, not sick, just not refreshed, like your body never fully recharged. Millions of adults experience this, and many assume it's simply aging. But aging isn't always the whole story. As we get older, several important systems begin changing. Muscle recovery slows. Hormonal rhythms become less predictable. Deep sleep becomes harder to maintain. And perhaps most importantly, blood sugar regulation becomes less stable. That last one surprises people because they assume blood sugar only matters if you have diabetes. Not true. Blood sugar affects everyone, every single night. Here's what often happens. You eat dinner. Several hours pass. Your body gradually uses the energy from that meal. Then sometime during the night, blood sugar begins drifting lower. For some people, that's no problem. For others, the body responds by releasing stress hormones. Not enough to wake you completely, just enough to interrupt deep sleep, just enough to pull you into lighter sleep stages, just enough to leave you feeling less restored in the morning. And the strange part? Most people never know it's happening. They simply wake up tired and blame age. But what if the issue isn't age? What if it's fuel? Why blood sugar stability matters more than most people think. Imagine driving across the country. You wouldn't want your fuel gauge swinging wildly between full and empty all night long. You'd want a steady supply, a smooth ride, no sudden emergencies. Your body works the same way during sleep. When energy remains relatively stable, the body stays focused on repair. When energy becomes less stable, the body shifts into management mode. Instead of recovery, instead of restoration, instead of maintenance. And that's where peanut butter starts becoming interesting. Not because it's magical, not because it's a superfood, but because of its composition, protein, healthy fats, a small amount of carbohydrates. Together, they digest relatively slowly, which means they provide a gradual release of energy instead of a rapid spike followed by a crash. And that difference matters, because a steady overnight energy supply may help support the biological processes that make sleep restorative in the first place. But blood sugar is only part of the story, because the next benefit has nothing to do with energy and everything to do with your brain. Jima, the sleep hormone connection nobody talks about. Most people think sleep starts in the bedroom. It doesn't. Sleep starts in the brain. Hours before your head touches the pillow. Every evening, your brain begins preparing for rest. One of the key players in that process is melatonin, the hormone associated with sleep timing. But melatonin doesn't simply appear. Your body has to create it, and creating it requires raw materials. One of those raw materials is an amino acid called tryptophan. You've probably heard of it before. What's fascinating is that foods containing protein naturally contain amino acids, including tryptophan. And once inside the body, tryptophan becomes part of a chain of events that ultimately supports normal melatonin production. Now, peanut butter isn't the highest source available, but it does contain meaningful amounts. And because it also contains healthy fats, it creates a combination many researchers find interesting when studying evening nutrition. Does that mean peanut butter is a sleeping pill? Of course not. But it does mean the food contains nutrients involved in systems that influence sleep quality. And when adults over 50 begin paying attention to those systems, they often notice something surprising. Sleep isn't only about how long you're in bed. It's about what your body is doing while you're there. And that's exactly where the next benefit becomes even more important. Because one of the biggest reasons people wake up at night has nothing to do with melatonin and everything to do with hunger. Why so many adults wake up hungry at 2 a.m.? Here's a question. How many times have you woken up in the middle of the night for no obvious reason? No loud noise, no discomfort, no explanation, just awake. Many people immediately blame stress. Sometimes they're right, but not always, because hunger hormones continue working while you sleep, and after 50, those signals can become more noticeable. The result? Your body may become more likely to send subtle wake-up signals during the night, not because you need a full meal, but because your system wants stability. This is where foods containing both protein and fat become useful. Protein tends to be satisfying. Fat slows digestion. Together, they help create a feeling of fullness that often lasts longer than foods built primarily around refined carbohydrates, which means fewer overnight hunger signals, fewer interruptions, and potentially more consistent sleep. But we're just scratching the surface. Because the reason many active adults over 50 are interested in bedtime protein has nothing to do with hunger. It has to do with what happens inside your muscles while you're sleeping. And that's where things get even more interesting. What happens to your muscles while you sleep? Most people think muscles are built during exercise. They're not. Exercise creates the signal, sleep creates the repair. That's a huge difference. Every walk, every workout, every flight of stairs, every grocery bag you carry, every yard project, every active thing you do during the day creates tiny amounts of stress inside muscle tissue. That's normal. In fact, it's necessary. But the rebuilding process doesn't happen while you're moving. It happens later, usually while you're asleep. And after 50, this process becomes less efficient. Researchers sometimes refer to this as age-related anabolic resistance. In simple terms, your muscles become less responsive to the same amount of protein that worked perfectly in your younger years. The body becomes harder to impress, which means nutrition timing starts mattering more, not because timing is magic, but because older muscles often benefit from having a steady supply of amino acids available during recovery periods. And guess when the biggest recovery period occurs? At night, while you're sleeping. This is one reason bedtime protein has attracted so much attention in aging research, not because it turns back the clock, but because it may help support the body's natural overnight rebuilding process. And peanut butter happens to provide a combination of protein and healthy fats that digest gradually rather than disappearing immediately. Think of it this way. If your body runs an overnight repair crew, protein provides some of the building materials. No materials. Limited repairs, better materials, better opportunity for maintenance. But muscles aren't the only thing affected, because the next morning might actually be where many people notice the biggest difference. Why some people wake up refreshed and others don't. Let's talk about mornings. Not the first 5 minutes, the first 2 hours, because that's where many adults notice a problem. They wake up. They're technically awake. But mentally, not quite. Everything feels slow, heavy, foggy. Like the brain needs extra time to come online. Most people immediately reach for caffeine. And while caffeine can help temporarily, it doesn't always address the reason the problem exists. Sometimes the issue started hours earlier, during sleep. Remember those nighttime blood sugar swings we discussed? When the body needs to release stress hormones to compensate for falling energy levels? Those hormones don't always disappear instantly. They can influence how you feel after waking up. That's why some people experience that strange combination of being tired and wired at the same time. Low energy, but restless, fatigued, but unable to fully relax. When overnight energy remains more stable, those hormonal fluctuations may become less dramatic. And when those fluctuations become less dramatic, mornings often feel different, not miraculous, just smoother, clearer, more consistent. And consistency matters, because the older we get, the more valuable, predictable energy becomes. But there's another reason peanut butter keeps showing up in these conversations, and it has nothing to do with protein, nothing to do with blood sugar, and nothing to do with calories. It comes down to a mineral that many adults aren't getting enough of. The mineral. Most adults are missing. Let's play a quick game. If I asked people over 50 which nutrient they're worried about, most would probably say protein, calcium, vitamin D, maybe B12. Very few would say magnesium. Yet magnesium participates in hundreds of processes throughout the body: muscle function, nerve signaling, energy production, relaxation, sleep regulation, and much more. That's why researchers continue studying its role in healthy aging. Here's what's interesting. Many adults consume less magnesium than experts recommend, not because they're trying to, but because modern diets often contain fewer magnesium-rich foods than diets of previous generations. And when magnesium intake drops, several things can become more noticeable: muscle tightness, poor sleep quality, restlessness, occasional nighttime discomfort. Again, magnesium isn't a cure-all, but it's undeniably important. And peanut butter contains a meaningful amount, not enough to solve a deficiency by itself, but enough to contribute, which is why nutrition experts often emphasize overall dietary patterns rather than single foods. A food doesn't have to provide everything, it just has to contribute something useful. And peanut butter checks that box surprisingly well. But now we need to address the question that always comes next. Because whenever people hear "eat before bed," they immediately worry about one thing: weight gain. And honestly, that's understandable. Does eating before bed actually cause weight gain? This might be one of the most misunderstood nutrition topics on the internet. Some people believe eating after a certain hour automatically causes fat gain. Others claim timing doesn't matter at all. The truth sits somewhere in the middle. Your body doesn't suddenly start storing everything as fat at 8:01 p.m. That's not how human physiology works. What matters most is the overall pattern: total calorie intake, food quality, activity levels, sleep quality, consistency. Those factors usually matter far more than a specific clock time. However, the type of food eaten at night absolutely matters. A large sugary snack creates a very different response than a small protein-rich snack. Those aren't remotely equivalent. One creates rapid energy changes, the other tends to digest more gradually. And that's why researchers often separate late-night eating into categories rather than treating all nighttime foods as identical: a bag of cookies, a bowl of ice cream, and a tablespoon of natural peanut butter are completely different nutritional situations. Lumping them together creates confusion. The goal isn't to eat more. The goal is to eat smarter. And for many adults over 50, a small strategic bedtime snack may fit into a healthy routine surprisingly well. But there's another benefit that gets far less attention. And if you've ever worried about your heart health, this next section matters. Because what happens overnight affects far more than sleep. It affects your cardiovascular system too. What your heart is doing while you sleep. Most people think heart health is something that matters during the day, when you're walking, exercising, moving around. But nighttime is incredibly important. While you sleep, your cardiovascular system enters a recovery period. Heart rate changes, Blood pressure changes, hormones change, and ideally, the body uses this time to restore balance. Researchers have long observed that healthy sleep patterns are associated with healthier cardiovascular outcomes over time. That's one reason sleep quality has become such a major topic in modern health research. Not because sleep is passive, but because sleep is active maintenance. Now think about everything we've discussed so far: stable overnight energy, less disruption, more consistent recovery, better sleep architecture. These aren't isolated events, they're connected. And when the body gets more opportunities to remain in deep restorative sleep, multiple systems benefit simultaneously, including the cardiovascular system. But before you run to the kitchen and grab the nearest jar of peanut butter, there's something extremely important you need to know. Because not all peanut butter is the same, not even close. And choosing the wrong kind can completely change the conversation. The peanut butter mistake. Most people make. This is where things get interesting. Because when people hear peanut butter, they assume all peanut butter is basically the same. It isn't. In fact, two jars sitting next to each other on the same grocery shelf can behave very differently inside your body. One may contain little more than peanuts and a small amount of salt. The other may contain added sugars, syrups, stabilizers, and processed oils. And that's a completely different product. The problem is that many people never look at the ingredient label. They look at the front, the marketing, the pictures, the health claims, but the real story is usually on the back. Here's a simple rule. The shorter the ingredient list, the better. Ideally, peanuts, maybe salt, that's it. Because once manufacturers start adding large amounts of sugar, you're no longer getting the same slow, steady nutritional profile we've been discussing. You're getting something that may affect blood sugar very differently. And remember, the entire benefit we're talking about depends on stability, not spikes, not crashes. Stability. That's why natural peanut butter keeps showing up in discussions about healthy bedtime snacks. Not because it's trendy, because it's simple. And simple often wins. But choosing the right peanut butter is only half the equation. The next question is, what should you eat it with? Because certain combinations may be even more effective than peanut butter by itself. Combination number 1, peanut butter and banana. This is probably the most popular pairing, and there's a reason it has survived for decades. The flavors work together. The texture works together, and nutritionally, they complement each other surprisingly well. Bananas provide carbohydrates, peanut butter provides protein and fat. Together, they create a more gradual release of energy than either food alone. Think of it like building a team. Each player brings something different. The banana contributes quick availability. The peanut butter helps slow things down. The result feels more balanced. Now, does that mean everyone should eat bananas before bed? Not necessarily. Nutrition is always personal. But for many healthy adults, it's a practical combination that requires almost no preparation. Slice a banana. Add a spoonful of peanut butter. Done. No blender, no supplements, no expensive products. And that simplicity is part of the appeal. But if bananas aren't your thing, the next option might actually work even better. Combination number 2, peanut butter and whole grain toast. This is the option many active adults prefer, especially people who walk regularly, exercise, garden, stay busy, or simply feel hungrier in the evening. Whole grain bread provides complex carbohydrates, which generally digest more slowly than highly refined options. When paired with peanut butter, it creates a combination that many people find extremely satisfying. And satisfaction matters, because one of the biggest reasons people make poor food choices at night is simple. They're hungry, really hungry, not snack hungry, meal hungry. And once that happens, it's much harder to make intentional decisions. A small, balanced snack earlier often works better than fighting hunger for hours and eventually overeating. This isn't about eating more. It's about avoiding extremes. And for many adults over 50, that shift alone makes a noticeable difference. But there is one pairing that gets far less attention. And if weight management is one of your goals, it may be the smartest option of all. Combination number 3, peanut butter and apple slices. This is the combination I wish more people talked about because it solves several problems at once. First, apples provide fiber. Second, they're refreshing. Third, they're naturally portion controlled. Most people aren't going to accidentally eat 4 apples before bed, but they might accidentally eat half a bag of snacks. That's the difference. Fiber slows digestion, protein adds satisfaction, fat adds staying power. Together they create a snack that feels surprisingly substantial without being heavy, and that's exactly what many adults want in the evening, something that takes the edge off hunger, without feeling like a second dinner. And if you're someone who often wakes up feeling overly full after nighttime eating, this combination tends to be much gentler. But now we need to address something important. Because despite all these potential benefits, bedtime peanut butter isn't right for everyone, and ignoring that reality would be a mistake. Who should be careful? Whenever a health trend becomes popular, people start acting like it's universally beneficial. That's rarely true. There are always exceptions. For example, anyone with a peanut allergy should obviously avoid peanut butter entirely. No discussion needed. There are alternatives available, but peanut butter itself isn't worth the risk. Some people also notice that higher fat foods late at night don't agree with them, particularly those who deal with digestive discomfort or reflux symptoms. Others may have specific dietary plans that require a different approach. The point is simple. Good health advice always includes context. A strategy that works beautifully for one person may not be ideal for another. That's why it's important to pay attention to your own body instead of blindly copying what works for someone else. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is finding what supports you. And that brings us to the most important question of the entire video. Because even if peanut butter fits your lifestyle perfectly, most people still get the amount wrong. And that mistake can erase many of the benefits. In the final section, I'll show you exactly how much to eat, when to eat it, and the one mistake that turns a smart bedtime snack into an unnecessary calorie bomb. The biggest mistake people make with peanut butter, let's get practical, because this is where most people go wrong, not with the idea, with the amount. Peanut butter is one of those foods that's incredibly easy to underestimate. A spoonful becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and before you realize it, you've eaten several hundred calories without thinking about it. That's why portion size matters a lot. The people who seem to get the best results from a bedtime peanut butter habit usually aren't eating huge amounts. They're eating enough, not more. And that's an important distinction, because the goal isn't to go to bed full. The goal is to go to bed supported. There's a difference. One leaves you heavy, the other leaves you comfortable. And comfort is exactly what we're after. So, how much is actually enough? For most adults, a modest serving is all that's needed. Not half the jar, not a giant sandwich, just a small amount. Enough to provide protein, enough to provide healthy fats, enough to help create stability through the night. Remember, we're not trying to replace dinner. We're not trying to create a second meal. We're simply giving the body a little support before its longest recovery period. And that's why consistency beats quantity every single time. A reasonable habit repeated for weeks is far more powerful than a huge serving eaten once. The body responds to patterns, not isolated events. That's true for sleep, it's true for nutrition, and it's true for long-term health. Timing matters more than most people realize now. Here's something many people overlook. The timing doesn't need to be perfect, but it shouldn't be random either. Eating the moment your head hits the pillow isn't ideal. Your body still needs a little time to begin digestion. Think about it. You're asking your system to do 2 jobs at once: digest food and prepare for sleep. Giving yourself a short buffer simply makes sense. That's why many people find the habit works best as part of a routine, not as a last-second decision. Maybe it's after brushing your teeth. Maybe it's while reading. Maybe it's during the final part of your evening wind down. The exact routine doesn't matter. The consistency does. Because routines help train the brain, and the brain loves predictability, especially when sleep is involved. What most people notice first now. Here's the interesting part. When people do notice changes, they often aren't the changes they expected. Many assume they'll suddenly sleep an extra 2 hours or wake up feeling 20 years younger. That's not usually how real improvements happen. Instead, the changes tend to be subtle at first. Fewer overnight awakenings, less hunger before bed, more stable energy in the morning, a little less brain fog, a little more consistency. And consistency is often the first sign that something is working. Because health improvements rarely arrive like fireworks. They arrive quietly, one better morning, then another, until one day you realize something feels different, not dramatic, just better. And sometimes better is exactly what people have been searching for. The bigger lesson. But honestly, this video isn't really about peanut butter. Not completely. It's about understanding something much bigger. Small habits matter, more than most people think. People spend years looking for complicated answers, the perfect supplement, the perfect diet, the perfect routine. Meanwhile, many of the most useful health habits are surprisingly simple. A short walk after dinner, a consistent bedtime, better hydration, a little more protein, a little less processed food, and sometimes something as ordinary as a spoonful of peanut butter before bed. Not because it's magic, because it fits into a pattern, and healthy aging is almost always about patterns, not shortcuts. Final thoughts. If you're over 50, your body is still working for you every single night, repairing, recovering, rebuilding, preparing you for tomorrow. The question is, are you giving it what it needs to do that job well? Because the difference between feeling exhausted every morning and feeling reasonably refreshed often isn't one massive change. It's a collection of small decisions repeated consistently. That's how long-term health is built. One choice at a time, one night at a time, one habit at a time. So if peanut butter is something you enjoy and it fits your overall eating pattern, it may be worth experimenting with thoughtfully and seeing how your body responds. Pay attention. Notice your sleep. Notice your energy. Notice your mornings. Your body usually tells you more than any headline ever will. And sometimes the most valuable health discoveries aren't hidden in a laboratory. They're already sitting on a shelf in your kitchen.